Hi, this is Dr. David Tranter, and welcome to video 2 of Relationships Matter Most, an introduction to the third path framework for student well-being and achievement. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the research and big ideas that underline the third path framework. So let's start off with this quote, and I think it's a perfect way to capture our kind of mindset when we're looking at this framework. And it says this: what if everything we do to promote children's positive development hinges upon a similarly essential element? What if the efficacy of every policy, program, or intervention is determined by whether such effort ultimately promoted or hindered the active mechanisms associated with such an ingredient, the developmental active ingredient? So what the authors of this article are sort of proposing and ultimately answering is this idea that there is an active ingredient, and in fact they suggest, as we do, that relationships are that active ingredient in any initiative that we undertake with children or youth. And if we get relationships right, then that initiative, whether it's a program or a strategy, instructional strategy or social emotional strategy, it is more likely to succeed if those relationships are genuinely in place. And if they're not in place, then it may well be doomed to failure. And that, as we'll see, not just any old kinds of relationships, but something that really supports development. The next thing that we looked at is the relationship between social emotional learning and academic learning. And historically, as I talked about in the last video, they've been separated into a kind of path 1 of academics, the school path, and the social emotional path, path 2, has been the world of families and social workers and others. But as we see all of the science kind of emerging on this, we see that in truth, social, emotional, and cognitive development all occur in the same part of the brain. They occur at the same time. And, to be precise then, to suggest that there's a time when we do social emotional learning and then a time when we do kind of cognitive academic work is simply false. They're two sides of the same coin. They happen at the same time. And it would suggest, therefore, that you can develop social emotional skills while doing academics, and that academics don't necessarily have to be parked. And in fact shouldn't be in order to develop social emotional skills. That is a really important idea that informed our framework. The other thing that we really looked at is how much of research really supports the notion that relationships are important when it comes to learning and development. And what we found overwhelmingly as more and more of these large-scale meta-analyses of studies have come out, that they keep finding that at the core of, again, learning and development are relationships, articles like this one. I went through all the literature I could find to look at empirical studies that looked at connections between positive relationships between teacher and student and different types of academic and non-academic outcomes. And you can see in the list here that it's pretty exhaustive, that when you have better relationships with students, just about all aspects of learning and development are improved. So as we're looking at what joins path 1 and path 2 to become a kind of third path, it becomes pretty clear that relationships are the common denominator. We see that if you want to improve your well-being, relationships are really core to doing it. But even when it comes to achievement, the research shows time and again that you'll improve achievement outcomes by investing in relationships. And so it wasn't really very hard to kind of come across this idea that relationships really should be the focus when we're looking at educational practices that support well-being and achievement. That if we can focus on relationships, we're going to improve both of those. And that ultimately was then what created this integration of path 1 and path 2 into a third path. We realized that the brain is a highly, highly social thing. We are social creatures, that we learn through and by connection, and that relationships are really essential in order for us to learn and develop. But I do want to say, because sometimes people hear this and say, well, you're just saying have nice relationships. That's not new, and that's not very sophisticated. But what we are saying, and what the research is saying, is no, think of these in terms of developmental relationships. What are the aspects of the relationship that promote development? So we're not just generically saying, have good relationships. We're saying, look at the pieces of relationships, those components of relationships that promote development. That was our real challenge. Another thing that really informs our model, and I think is really consistent with the kind of mindset of our framework, is the work of Alison Gopnik, and her book, The Gardener and Carpenter, I think is a great example of a kind of a core big idea. She is quite clear and critical of the carpenter mindset when it comes to parenting and educating kids. And the carpenter mindset is this tendency that we all have to decide in advance the skills that kids should have, the kind of blueprint for success. And then we try to teach those skills to those kids. We try to shape and cajole and move and, push them to get those skills for success. It sounds like a really good thing. But as Alison Gopnik points out, it often backfires. And in a lot of ways, when we do that, we ignore all kinds of surprising and different types of potential that kids can have because we're focusing only on one type of potential and ignoring all these others. And she suggests that we need to be really thinking about having a gardener mindset in which we focus on building a really rich environment for kids to flourish and flourish on their own terms rather than deciding in advance all the ways that they should succeed. This is not that far off another idea, and that is the distinction between the conservative cultivation approach to children, and particularly parenting, but this happens a lot in education as well, and the natural growth approach. So conservative cultivation is a lot like the carpenter approach, in which we have certain attributes and traits and skills that, again, we think kids need, and then we cultivate them in kids. And that's been proving to show some problems. When we decide in advance all the kinds of things that kids need to have, and then we kind of give them to them. Because there's another approach, the natural growth approach, which allows kids more room to explore and express who they are. Now, I don't think anyone's saying, and certainly we're not saying, don't do any concerted cultivation. We're really seeing this as a continuum and asking the question, to what degree have we got this balance right? In our book, we talk about a relationship orientation to education and a task orientation, and it's very similar to the last two slides in terms of looking for the right balance. Clearly, education is about tasks and the completion of tasks, but there's another side to this, and that's the importance of relationships. And tasks and relationships don't have to be in conflict with one another, but they often are perceived in conflict of either spending a lot of time building relationships, you're not accomplishing as much in terms of tasks. Sometimes teachers will push through tasks at the expense of relationships. Okay. So if we were to summarize the thinking behind the framework before we get into all the pieces of the framework, it's this, that we know that relationships are critical. We know that relationships are really about the quality and nature of connections, and that these connections are really what drive learning and growth, especially as we prepare kids for a future that's uncertain. And so what we are really talking about when we're talking about our framework, which will be in the next video, is how do we create fertile soil for genuine development? What are the conditions of that soil? What needs to be in that soil for all students to really grow and thrive and develop? So in our next video, we're going to actually look at the framework and look at those conditions, the conditions of the soil, as it were, to understand them a little bit more. So we'll see you in video 3. Thanks. Bye-bye.